Rome wasn't just an empire. It was a religious contract between gods and mortals that had kept the greatest civilization on Earth running for nearly 1,000 years. Break that contract, and you didn't just commit a crime. You endangered every single person in the empire. The Romans called it mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. Every law, every tradition, every ritual had been tested by centuries of practice. When Romans conquered new territories, they didn't just take land. They absorbed foreign gods into their pantheon, carefully integrating them into the existing system. This wasn't tolerance. It was risk management. More gods meant more divine protection, as long as those gods played by Roman rules. At the center of this religious fortress stood the Vestals, 6 virgin priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. These women weren't just symbolic. They were the living embodiment of Rome's purity and power. Chosen between ages 6 and 10, they served for 30 years under a vow of absolute chastity. Their sacred duty was maintaining the eternal flame in Vesta's temple. If that flame went out, Romans believed the empire itself would fall. The consequences for breaking that vow were designed to terrify. A Vestal who lost her virginity would be buried alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water, then sealed in to suffocate slowly. The man involved would be beaten to death publicly. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered necessary. The Vestal's purity literally protected Rome from the wrath of the gods. Roman religion operated on a principle of do ut des, I give so that you may give. Sacrifices, prayers, rituals, all were transactions with the divine. Screw up the formula, and the gods would withdraw their protection. Famine, plague, military defeat. These weren't random disasters. They were divine punishment for religious failure. This system had rules that nobody, not even emperors, could break with impunity. Certain animals could only be sacrificed to certain gods. Specific prayers had to be recited with exact wording. Priests followed ritual calendars that had been refined over centuries. And there was one absolute prohibition that Romans had maintained since 97 BC. No human sacrifice. Ever. That law came after Rome had fought desperate wars that threatened its existence. In moments of extreme crisis, the Senate had occasionally authorized human sacrifice as a last resort. But after establishing dominance over the Mediterranean world, Rome officially banned the practice. Human sacrifice was what barbarians did. Civilized Rome had evolved beyond such primitive brutality. Foreign cults could exist in Rome, but they had to follow Roman rules. The worship of Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, all these gods found homes in Rome. But they came as guests, not replacements. Jupiter remained king of the gods. The traditional Roman pantheon stayed supreme. Foreign deities could supplement Roman religion, never supplant it. The emperor himself was bound by these rules. Yes, emperors were worshipped as gods after death, and some living emperors received divine honors in the provinces. But in Rome itself, the emperor was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the traditional religion. His job was protecting and maintaining the ancient ways, not destroying them. Emperors who violated religious norms paid for it. Caligula tried to present himself as a living god and got assassinated. Nero persecuted Christians and burned down half of Rome, earning eternal damnation in historical memory. Commodus dressed up as Hercules and fought as a gladiator, debasing the imperial dignity until his own court had him strangled. But all of these emperors, mad as they were, never tried to replace Jupiter. They never married Vestal virgins. They never brought foreign gods to rule over Roman ones. They bent the rules, stretched them, violated them in spectacular ways. But they never attempted to completely rewrite the religious foundation of Rome itself. The Roman aristocracy, the senators and equestrians who actually ran the empire, understood that religion wasn't just about belief. It was about power, legitimacy, and social control. The moment you started messing with the gods, you were messing with the entire structure that kept millions of people obedient to Roman authority. This was the system that had conquered the Mediterranean world, that had survived civil wars and barbarian invasions. that had transformed Rome from a small city-state into an empire spanning 3 continents. It was rigid, conservative, and absolutely non-negotiable. But in 218 AD, a 14-year-old boy from Syria was about to take a sledgehammer to the entire structure, and he wouldn't just bend the rules or violate a few taboos. He would attempt to completely replace Roman religion with something that would make every senator, every priest, and every citizen of Rome question whether the gods had finally abandoned them. When Elagabalus entered Rome in 219 AD, he wasn't alone. Ahead of his triumphal procession, carried on a golden chariot pulled by white horses, came the physical manifestation of his god. A massive black meteorite, cone-shaped and ancient, that the people of Emesa had worshipped as Elagabal, the god of the sun, for centuries. Romans lined the streets to see their new emperor, this teenage boy who claimed to be the illegitimate son of the popular emperor Caracalla. What they saw instead was a Syrian priest dressed in flowing purple silk robes embroidered with gold, wearing a towering jeweled crown, his face painted with cosmetics in the Eastern fashion. He didn't look like a Roman emperor. He looked like something from a foreign temple. But the boy himself wasn't the shock. It was what he did immediately upon arriving in the capital. Elagabalus announced that the black stone he'd brought from Syria was now the supreme god of Rome, not a god among many, not even equal to Jupiter, superior to Jupiter, the new chief deity of the Roman pantheon. To house his god, Elagabalus ordered the construction of the Elagabalium, a massive temple on the Palatine Hill, the most sacred ground in Rome where emperors had lived for centuries. The historian Herodian recorded that Elagabalus spared no expense, making it the most magnificent temple in Rome, covered in gold and precious stones, surrounded by elaborate courtyards and altars. Then came the systematic humiliation of Roman religion. Elagabalus ordered the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena that Aeneas supposedly brought from Troy and that Romans believed protected their city, transferred to the Elagabalium. He commanded that the sacred fire of Vesta be moved from her ancient temple to his new one. The shields of Mars, the warrior god who had made Rome's conquests possible, were relocated to sit at the feet of a foreign rock. Roman priests and priestesses found themselves serving a god they didn't recognize, performing rituals that violated everything they'd been trained to do since childhood. Elagabalus replaced the traditional Roman priesthood with his own Syrian attendants, men who'd served the sun god in Emesa and who now brought their foreign practices into the heart of Roman religious life. The Senate watched in horror, but said nothing. This boy controlled the legions. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, was a master political operator who'd engineered his rise to power by convincing Syrian legions that he was Caracalla's son. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers who'd killed more than one emperor, were being paid enormous bonuses to keep them loyal. Speaking out against the emperor's religious revolution was suicide. But Elagabalus wasn't satisfied with just relocating Roman sacred objects. He demanded that traditional Roman gods bow to his Syrian deity. He arranged a ceremonial marriage between his black stone and Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. Later, deciding that Minerva wasn't suitable, he divorced the gods and married his stone to Urania, the Carthaginian version of Astarte, another foreign deity. The concept of gods marrying wasn't completely foreign to Romans. Mythological divine marriages existed in their stories. But those were myths, not active religious practice. Elagabalus was forcing actual sacred objects, items that Romans had venerated for centuries, into ritual marriages orchestrated by a teenage boy playing priest. Roman religious conservatives were trapped in a nightmare. Their entire worldview depended on maintaining the Pax Deorum, peace with the gods, through proper ritual observance. Now a foreign teenager was randomly mashing together Roman and Syrian deities like a child playing with toys, violating every principle of religious order that had kept Rome safe for a millennium. Dion Cassius, a Roman senator who witnessed these events, wrote with barely contained rage about Elagabalus's mockery of Roman tradition. He described how the emperor forced senators and other dignitaries to attend elaborate ceremonies where they had to bow down to a rock, kiss its base, and participate in Syrian rituals that felt alien and degrading to Roman aristocrats. The annual procession became a particular horror show. Each summer, Elagabalus organized a massive festival where the black stone was paraded through Rome's streets on a chariot studded with gold and jewels, pulled by 6 white horses that only the emperor was allowed to lead. He walked backwards in front of the chariot, facing the stone, dressed in full priestly regalia, while musicians played Syrian instruments and dancers performed foreign rites. Senators and nobles were required to run alongside this procession, some sources say, scattering gold and silver coins to the crowds, while the teenage emperor danced ecstatically before his god. For Rome's traditional elite, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was a violation of dignitas, the serious composure and gravitas that defined Roman leadership. The common people of Rome reacted with confusion and growing unease. They'd accepted foreign gods before. Temples to Isis and Mithras dotted the city. But those gods had come as additions, not replacements. Those cults existed alongside traditional Roman worship, not above it. What Elagabalus demanded was complete submission to a deity most Romans had never heard of until a Syrian teenager forced it down their throats. Religious anxiety began spreading through Rome. If the traditional gods were being displaced, would they withdraw their protection? Every plague, every food shortage, every military setback could now be interpreted as divine punishment for abandoning Jupiter and the ancestral deities. The collective religious trauma was building toward crisis levels. But the black stone and the relocated sacred objects were just the beginning. Elagabalus had learned his religious practices in Emesa, where the cult of Elagabal involved rituals that would make Roman stomachs turn. And he was about to import those practices into the heart of the Roman Empire, starting with a marriage that would shatter the most sacred institution in Roman religion. In 220 AD, approximately 1 year into his reign, Elagabalus committed what Romans considered the single most catastrophic sacrilege in their 1,000-year history. He married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. To understand the absolute horror this caused, you need to understand what Vestals meant to Rome. These weren't just priestesses, they were living guarantees of Rome's continued existence. The safety of every person in the empire, from the poorest peasant to the richest senator, depended on these 6 women maintaining their virginity and tending Vesta's eternal flame. Aquilia Severa had been chosen for this sacred duty as a young girl. She'd taken vows that were supposed to last 30 years. Breaking those vows meant death for her, death for any man who touched her, and potentially divine destruction for all of Rome. The punishment for a Vestal who lost her virginity was being buried alive in an underground chamber, sealed in with a small amount of food and water, left to suffocate in darkness. This wasn't cruelty. This was Romans desperately trying to appease the gods after such a catastrophic violation. But Elagabalus didn't care about Roman law or Roman terror. He wanted Aquilia Severa, and he wanted her precisely because she was a Vestal. His reasoning, preserved in historical accounts, reveals how completely his Syrian religious worldview had displaced any understanding of Roman sensibilities. According to Dio Cassius, who was serving in the Senate during this period, Elagabalus justified the marriage by claiming that the union of a priest-emperor with a virgin priestess would produce divine children, offspring blessed by the gods who would possess supernatural qualities. In his Syrian theological framework, this made perfect sense. Sacred sexuality, ritual marriages between religious figures, these were normal practices in many Eastern cults. For Romans, this was theological insanity. Vestals were virgins specifically because their chastity protected Rome. The entire point was that they never had children, never married, never engaged in any sexual activity whatsoever. Elagabalus had taken the one thing that made Vestals sacred and destroyed it, then claimed he was doing Rome a favor. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted with full imperial pomp. Elagabalus insisted on treating it as a legitimate state marriage, forcing senators and other officials to attend and witness this abomination. Imagine being a Roman aristocrat, standing in that ceremony, watching a teenage emperor marry a woman whose virginity was supposed to be more protected than the emperor's own life. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Romans genuinely believed that this marriage would bring divine wrath down on their city. Every subsequent disaster, military setback, food shortage, or plague outbreak would be interpreted as the gods punishing Rome for allowing this sacrilege to continue. Roman religious conservatives were trapped. They couldn't execute the Vestal according to traditional law because she hadn't chosen to break her vows. The emperor had forced her into marriage. They couldn't kill the emperor because he controlled the military. They couldn't even speak out too loudly because Elagabalus had demonstrated his willingness to purge anyone who opposed his religious reforms. Aquileia Severa's own feelings about this forced marriage are lost to history. She was likely in her 20s, having served as a Vestal for years. She would have been raised from childhood believing that her virginity protected Rome, and that losing it meant death and divine punishment. Now she was trapped in a marriage that violated everything she'd been taught, with an emperor who saw her as a component in his religious experimentation. But here's where Elagabalus revealed just how little he understood or cared about Roman sensibilities. After divorcing Aquileia Severa to briefly marry another woman, Annia Faustina, a descendant of the respected emperor Marcus Aurelius, he divorced again and remarried Aquileia Severa. He married the same Vestal virgin twice, as if her sacred status was something he could casually engage with and abandon based on his whims. The justification remained the same. He wanted divine children. The obsession with producing offspring through this sacred union suggests that Elagabalus genuinely believed in his theological framework. He wasn't just being deliberately provocative. He actually thought that his priest-emperor status plus a virgin priestess would produce children with special divine qualities. The fact that no children resulted from either marriage to Aquileia Severa only increased Roman anxiety. Was this proof that the gods rejected the union? Was Rome's lack of divine punishment evidence that the gods had already abandoned the city? Religious speculation and dread permeated every level of Roman society. Dio Cassius recorded that Elagabalus claimed he was acting with divine approval, that his god Elagabal had commanded this marriage. For Romans, this was theological terrorism. Their entire religious system was based on following established rituals and maintaining ancestral traditions. Elagabalus was claiming direct divine revelation that overrode 1,000 years of Roman religious law. The marriage to Aquileia Severa wasn't just about one emperor violating one sacred tradition. It represented the complete breakdown of the system that made Rome function. If the emperor could override religious law this fundamentally, what other foundations of Roman society could he destroy on a whim? But while Romans were still reeling from this violation of their most sacred institution, Elagabalus was transforming his palace into something that would make the Aquileia Severa marriage look almost quaint by comparison. The Palatine Hill, home of emperors, was about to become the center of religious practices that would force Roman matrons into situations that violated everything aristocratic Roman women had been raised to protect. The Elagabalium wasn't just a temple. It was becoming the center of religious practices that Romans associated with the most degraded foreign cults. What happened inside that golden-roofed building made senators physically ill when they discussed it in hushed conversations away from imperial spies. To understand what Elagabalus was implementing, you need to know about hierodulia, sacred prostitution. In various ancient Near Eastern cults, including some Syrian traditions, temple prostitutes weren't considered degraded. They were sacred servants performing religious duties. Sexual activity in these contexts was ritualized, connected to fertility worship and devotion to deities associated with sexuality and reproduction. Romans knew about these practices. They'd encountered them throughout the Eastern territories, and they found them absolutely repulsive. Roman sexual morality was complex and often hypocritical. Men could visit regular prostitutes with relative social acceptance, but for respectable women, especially aristocratic matrons, sexual purity and fidelity were non-negotiable. A Roman matron's sexual behavior directly impacted her family's honor and her husband's political standing. Elagabalus didn't just tolerate sacred prostitution in his new temple. According to hostile sources, particularly Dio Cassius, who witnessed these events as a senator, he actively incorporated it into his religious ceremonies. But here's where it gets truly twisted. He didn't just employ professional prostitutes or willing participants. He allegedly compelled Roman noblewomen to participate in these rituals. Dio Cassius, writing with barely suppressed rage, described how Elagabalus would force aristocratic women to attend religious ceremonies at the Elagabalium, where they were required to engage in activities that Dio characterized as degrading and sexually compromising. The exact nature of these activities is described vaguely in sources, whether because Dio was too disgusted to be specific or because he was exaggerating for political effect. We can't know with certainty. What we can verify is the social panic this caused among Rome's elite families. Aristocratic marriages were political and economic alliances. A wife's sexual fidelity wasn't just personal morality. It was essential for legitimate inheritance, family honor, and political alliances. The suggestion that the emperor could compel their wives and daughters to participate in sexually charged religious rituals created terror throughout the senatorial class. The historian Herodian, writing shortly after these events, mentioned that Elagabalus staged elaborate nocturnal ceremonies in his temple that involved practices not customary among Romans. This careful phrasing suggests activities that Herodian's audience would understand as sexual or at least transgressive, without him having to explicitly describe them. Whether these ceremonies involved actual sexual activity or just sexually suggestive dancing and ritual behavior, the effect was the same. Roman noble families felt that their women were being deliberately degraded as part of Elagabalus's religious program. In a society where a woman's sexual reputation could destroy an entire family's political prospects, this was warfare against the aristocracy. Some modern historians suggest that ancient sources exaggerated Elagabalus's sexual transgressions as part of a propaganda campaign to justify his assassination. There's truth to this. Roman historians had a standard playbook for demonizing bad emperors, accusing them of sexual depravity, religious sacrilege, and tyrannical behavior. We should be skeptical of every specific claim. But even if we assume significant exaggeration, something was happening that genuinely terrified Roman elites. The consistent thread through multiple ancient sources is that Elagabalus was forcing respectable Roman women into situations they considered religiously and sexually compromising. Whether that was actual temple prostitution or just participation in Eastern-style religious ceremonies that seemed sexually charged to conservative Romans, the social impact was devastating. The ceremonies themselves apparently mixed Syrian religious practices with Elagabalus's own innovations. Ancient sources mention musicians playing foreign instruments, dancers performing in styles unfamiliar to Romans, incense and perfumes from the East, creating atmospheres that Romans associated with brothels rather than temples, and the constant presence of Elagabalus himself, dressed in flowing silk robes, his face painted, conducting rituals in Aramaic that most Romans couldn't understand. For Roman senators forced to attend these ceremonies with their wives, the experience was humiliating on multiple levels. They were watching their emperor, who was supposed to embody Roman dignity and martial virtue, behaving like an Eastern priest. They were seeing their city's most sacred hill, the Palatine where Augustus had lived, transformed into what they considered a foreign cult center. And they were watching their women participate in rituals that felt alien and threatening to Roman social order. Elagabalus apparently didn't see any problem with this. In his worldview, shaped by growing up as a priest in Emesa, sacred sexuality and elaborate religious ceremonies, involving both men and women, were normal expressions of devotion. He genuinely seems to have believed he was elevating Roman religion by introducing these sophisticated Eastern practices. But the disconnect between Elagabalus's intentions and Roman reception was total. What he thought was bringing divine blessing to Rome, they experienced as systematic assault on their most fundamental values. The temple he built to honor his god, they saw as a brothel on sacred ground. The ceremonies he conducted with religious devotion, they interpreted as forcing their women into degradation. Dio Cassius, in his account, used language that emphasized the violation of Roman social boundaries. He described noblewomen being compelled and forced to participate, stripping away any sense that this was voluntary religious devotion. Whether or not his account is entirely accurate, it reflects how Rome's elite interpreted these events, as an emperor using his power to deliberately humiliate the aristocracy through their women. The psychological warfare aspect of this shouldn't be underestimated. Roman senators had tolerated previous bad emperors. They'd survived Caligula, Nero, Commodus. But those emperors had directed their cruelty more randomly. Elagabalus was systematically targeting the sexual honor of aristocratic families, the one thing that Roman men were culturally obligated to protect at any cost. But while senators whispered about what happened to their wives in the Elagabalium, rumors of something far worse were spreading through Rome. Whispers about what Elagabalus was sacrificing to his foreign god. And if those rumors were true, or even if Romans believed they were true, the emperor had crossed from sacrilege into outright abomination. In 97 BC, the Roman Senate passed a law that defined civilized society. From that moment forward, human sacrifice was absolutely forbidden throughout Roman territory. This wasn't just legislation, it was a declaration that Rome had evolved beyond barbarism, that Roman religion operated on a higher moral plane than the primitive blood cults of their ancestors and their enemies. The last documented Roman human sacrifice had occurred in 114 BC, when Rome faced a military crisis so desperate that the Senate authorized the burial alive of 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks as an offering to the gods. Even then, Romans were uncomfortable with this action. It was treated as an emergency measure, not standard practice. After Rome secured its dominance over the Mediterranean, human sacrifice became the defining line between civilization and barbarism. So when rumors began spreading through Rome that Elagabalus was sacrificing children to his foreign god, the collective response was pure horror. These weren't just whispers in dark corners. Historical sources explicitly recorded these accusations, and whether they were true or propaganda, they represented Roman society's deepest fears about what this Syrian teenager was doing to their religion. Herodian, writing within a generation of these events, stated that Elagabalus performed sacrifices not in accordance with Roman custom, and mentioned that he slaughtered many victims in elaborate ceremonies. The language is carefully vague, but in the context of everything else Herodian described about Elagabalus's Syrian practices, Roman readers would have understood this as an accusation of human sacrifice. The Historia, Augusta, a later and less reliable source, makes the accusation explicit. According to this text, Elagabalus sacrificed children, selecting them specifically from noble families across Italy based on their physical beauty and the fact that both parents were still alive. The source claims he believed that sacrificing children with living parents made the offerings more acceptable to his god. Modern historians debate whether Elagabalus actually committed human sacrifice or whether these were accusations fabricated by his enemies to justify his assassination. The Historia Augusta is notorious for including invented scandals and exaggerations. Dio Cassius, usually more reliable, doesn't explicitly mention human sacrifice, though his descriptions of abominable and unholy rituals leave the door open for readers to draw their own conclusions. But here's what we know for certain. Romans believed Elagabalus was capable of human sacrifice, and that belief alone was enough to create a crisis. When historical sources record these accusations consistently, they're documenting genuine Roman fears, even if those fears were based on propaganda rather than reality. The terror among Rome's aristocracy was specific and personal. If the emperor was selecting children from noble families for sacrifice, every parent with a beautiful child was potentially at risk. Families that had spent generations building political alliances and accumulating wealth suddenly faced the possibility that their children might be chosen for religious murder by a teenage emperor who claimed divine authority. The selection criteria mentioned in sources, beauty, youth, both parents living, created a profile that would apply to many aristocratic children. Roman nobles had invested enormous resources in their children's education, arranged marriages for political advantage, planned inheritance strategies that depended on those children surviving to adulthood. Now they faced a threat that wealth and connections couldn't protect against. Whether or not actual human sacrifice occurred, the accusation served multiple purposes for Elagabalus's enemies. It painted him as fundamentally non-Roman, someone who had abandoned the most basic principle separating civilized society from barbarism. It gave religious justification for opposing him. He wasn't just a bad emperor. He was a threat to divine order who needed to be removed to prevent further godly wrath. And it created fear so intense that senators and soldiers might overcome their hesitation to commit imperial assassination. The rituals Elagabalus did definitely perform were disturbing enough without human sacrifice. Herodian documented that he slaughtered enormous numbers of animals in elaborate ceremonies that lasted for hours. He mentions hecatombs, sacrifices of 100 cattle at once, performed with Syrian priests chanting in Aramaic, while musicians played foreign instruments and dancers performed ecstatic movements unfamiliar to Roman religious practice. These animal sacrifices alone violated Roman ritual standards. Romans sacrificed animals too, but with specific protocols. Certain animals for certain gods, specific prayers recited in Latin with exact wording, priests wearing traditional Roman religious garments, the whole ceremony performed with dignified solemnity. Elagabalus's sacrifices were chaotic, ecstatic, foreign in every detail. The distinction between animal and human sacrifice might seem enormous to modern sensibilities, but to Romans, the violation of proper ritual form was already catastrophic. If Elagabalus was willing to throw out every established protocol for animal sacrifice, performing Syrian rituals in place of Roman ones, then was he also willing to revive the ultimate religious taboo? The accumulation of violations created an atmosphere where Romans were willing to believe anything about their emperor. He'd married a Vestal virgin, not once, but twice. He'd forced Roman sacred objects to bow before a foreign rock. He'd allegedly compelled noble women into degrading religious ceremonies. He'd replaced Jupiter with a Syrian sun god. At each step, he'd done something Romans thought was impossible, crossed a line they believed was uncrossable. So when accusations of child sacrifice began circulating, they fit into a pattern. Of course, this emperor who'd violated every other sacred boundary might also revive human sacrifice. The progression seemed logical, even inevitable. Each transgression made the next accusation more believable. The psychological state of Rome's elite by 221–222 AD was approaching collapse. They were living under an emperor who seemed to recognize no religious, social, or moral boundaries. Every day brought new violations of traditions that had defined Roman identity for a millennium. The question wasn't whether someone would move against Elagabalus. The question was when the breaking point would come, and it was coming soon. Because while Elagabalus continued his religious experiments, the one person who had put him on the throne in the first place was watching his escalating madness with growing alarm. Julia Maesa, his grandmother, was a survivor. She'd navigated the treacherous politics of multiple imperial courts, and she was beginning to realize that her grandson was going to get himself killed and possibly take the whole family down with him. She'd already prepared a backup plan. Another grandson, Alexianus, who later became Emperor Alexander Severus, a boy she could control, who understood how to play the political game, who wouldn't try to replace Roman religion with Syrian cult practices. All she needed was the right moment to make the switch. That moment was rapidly approaching. Rome had reached its breaking point. The city that had tolerated mad emperors before, that had survived civil wars and invasions, that had bent but never broken through centuries of crisis, had finally encountered something it couldn't absorb. A teenage emperor who genuinely believed he was a god, who saw Roman tradition as an obstacle to overcome rather than a foundation to respect, who was willing to sacrifice everything, possibly including children, to his foreign deity. The endgame was coming, and it would be brutal. By early 222 AD, Julia Maesa had seen enough. The woman who'd engineered her grandson's rise to power through careful manipulation of Syrian legions now faced the reality that Elagabalus was going to destroy everything she'd built. Every religious outrage, every violation of Roman sensibilities, every rumor of child sacrifice brought them closer to a revolt that would massacre the entire imperial family. She'd already been grooming the replacement, her other grandson, Alexianus, who would become Alexander Severus, was everything Elagabalus wasn't: respectful of Roman tradition, willing to take advice, controllable. Julia Maesa convinced Elagabalus to adopt Alexianus as his heir and give him the title Caesar, framing it as strengthening the dynasty. What she was really doing was giving Rome an alternative emperor before deposing the current one. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers who had the practical power to make and unmake emperors, were watching this setup with professional interest. They'd been paid enormous bonuses to support Elagabalus when he first arrived from Syria. But 4 years of religious chaos had exhausted even their mercenary tolerance. These were soldiers who valued Roman military tradition, and their emperor was a painted teenager who dressed like an Eastern priest and spent more time conducting bizarre religious ceremonies than dealing with actual imperial business. Elagabalus, despite his religious radicalism, wasn't stupid about power. He realized what his grandmother was doing. In March 222 AD, he tried to purge Alexianus and his supporters before they could move against him. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to arrest and execute his cousin. This was his fatal mistake. The Guard refused. For the first time in his reign, Elagabalus's orders were openly defied by the military force that kept him in power. He'd pushed too far, violated too many boundaries, alienated too many powerful constituencies. The soldiers looked at this 18-year-old emperor who'd spent 4 years offending every Roman sensibility, and they chose the alternative grandson instead. What happened next was swift and brutal. On March 11th, 222 AD, Praetorian soldiers stormed the palace. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, tried to hide. But imperial palaces don't have many genuine hiding places when the guards know every corridor. The soldiers found them and killed them both. But the violence didn't end with their deaths. The soldiers' rage, fed by 4 years of accumulated disgust at Elagabalus's behavior, demanded further humiliation. They dragged his corpse through Rome's streets, letting citizens spit on and mutilate the body of the emperor who'd tried to replace their gods. His mother's body received similar treatment, though she was less hated than her son. Then came the ultimate degradation. The soldiers threw both bodies into the sewers of Rome, literally flushing the emperor down the drain. But even the sewers rejected Elagabalus. The bodies created blockages, causing the system to back up. So the soldiers retrieved the corpses and threw them into the Tiber River, Rome's sacred waterway, now carrying the rotting remains of a failed god-emperor out to sea. The Senate immediately declared damnatio memoriae, damnation of memory. This wasn't just removing someone from history books. It was a systematic attempt to erase them from existence. Workers chiseled Elagabalus's name off every inscription, monument, and public building where it appeared. His portraits were destroyed. His coins were melted down and restruck. Any law or decree he'd issued was annulled. Rome was trying to pretend he'd never existed. The Elagabalium, the magnificent temple he'd built at such expense, was eventually destroyed or repurposed. The black meteorite, the god he'd tried to make supreme over Jupiter, was sent back to Emesa. Roman sacred objects were returned to their proper temples with elaborate purification ceremonies to cleanse them from contact with the foreign deity. Vesta's flame returned to its ancient home. The Palladium went back to protecting Rome from its traditional location. Aquilia Severa, the Vestal Virgin he'd married twice, faced an interesting fate. Normally, she should have been executed for losing her virginity. But since she'd been forced into the marriages by imperial command, and since Romans were desperately trying to restore normalcy, she was apparently allowed to retire from her sacred duties without the traditional horrible death. Rome needed healing, not more blood. Alexander Severus, the new emperor, immediately began restoring traditional Roman religion. He kept some of the foreign cults that had been properly integrated into Roman practice over the years. Isis and Mithras kept their temples. But he made it clear that Jupiter was back on top, that Roman tradition would be respected, that the social order Romans understood was being restored. The aristocracy breathed a collective sigh of relief. Their wives weren't being forced into temple ceremonies anymore. Their children weren't being eyed for sacrifice, real or imagined. The religious anxiety that had permeated Rome for 4 years began to dissipate. The gods, Romans believed, had been appeased by removing the sacrilegious emperor who'd threatened their worship. But here's what makes Elagabalus's story so disturbing from a historical perspective. He wasn't trying to be evil. From his own cultural and religious framework, everything he did made sense. He was a priest of a solar deity, raised from childhood to conduct elaborate religious ceremonies. He genuinely believed that bringing his god to Rome would benefit the empire. He thought marrying a virgin priestess would produce divine children. He saw Roman religion as primitive and in need of the sophistication his Syrian practices could provide. The tragedy is that he had absolute power to implement his vision, but zero understanding of the society he was trying to transform. Elagabalus never grasped that Roman religion wasn't just about which gods you worshipped. It was about maintaining social order, political legitimacy, and collective identity that had been built over 1,000 years. You couldn't just swap out gods like changing clothes and expect Romans to accept it. In 4 years, a teenage emperor demonstrated exactly why religious and cultural sensitivity matter when you're running an empire. He proved that you can have all the military power in the world, all the wealth, all the political machinery, and still destroy yourself by failing to understand the people you're trying to rule. Rome survived Elagabalus. The empire continued for another 2.5 centuries in the west, longer in the east. But those 4 years left scars. They showed how quickly an emperor could destabilize society by attacking its religious foundations. They demonstrated that even Rome's famous tolerance for foreign cults had hard limits, and they proved that sometimes the most dangerous emperor isn't the one who wants to conquer new territory or purge political enemies. Sometimes the most dangerous emperor is the teenager who genuinely believes he's a god, who thinks replacing Jupiter with a rock is religious progress, and who's willing to sacrifice every Roman tradition, and possibly Roman children, to prove his divine authority. Elagabalus didn't set out to become one of history's most hated emperors. He set out to bring religious enlightenment to Rome. The Romans thanked him by throwing his corpse in the river and trying to pretend he'd never existed. And maybe they were right to do so, because some experiments in religious revolution are so catastrophic that the only reasonable response is to erase them completely and pretend they were just a bad dream.